Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to our series on Catholic social justice. My name is Tim Maher. I'm the director of the Center for American Catholic Studies and also the American Catholic History Research Center, two of the organizations that are sponsoring this series of lectures and programs. It is also being sponsored by the Life Cycle Institute, and so I'd like to thank Steve Schneck and Bill Barberi from the Life Cycle Institute, and also I'd like to thank the Provost, John Convey, for his support of the Center for American Catholic Studies. In addition, I'd like to thank my colleagues in the Center for American Catholic Studies, Dean Hoagie, Leslie Tentler, Bill Dingus, and Chris Kaufman. And in particular, I'd like to thank Dr. Maria Mazenga, who did the a lot of the great work to organize this whole series of lectures. And as I said, this is our opening program, and this looking back at the economic pastoral of 1986 and its consequences. But we're also the thrust of the lecture series and programs is to look back, but also to look forward, to look to the future, and to think about, well, what are the problems, or how do we implement Catholic social justice principles now? Well, how do we do that? How do we think about that now? And so I just want to point your attention, and there are some brochures at the back, but we have a program next week on Wednesday, on Thursday, February 15th, in what we call the PRIS here, the Prisbilla Center. It's a discussion of asset building and Catholic social thought. And that will be in the PRIS Center, room 321. We also will have we'll take a break. The university goes on break for a week, and then we'll come back March 7th, a Wednesday, and have a discussion of the Catholic social justice and the current legislative agenda. And that will feature lobbyists, the lobbyists from the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, also the lobbyists from Network, and from Catholic Charities USA to talk about the current agenda for Catholic social justice in the Congress. And then finally, we will have a workshop on March 14th, Wednesday, at 7 p.m. That will be in the evening, and its focuses on the living wage movement, which has revived in recent years. And as you know, living wage has roots here at Catholic University, strong roots here in Catholic University, for which myself, as in charge of the Archives and Manuscripts Department, are very well aware, with the tradition of people like John A. Ryan and George Higgins. So we're delighted to have you here for today's symposium on the economic pastoral, the two sessions. But don't forget that the upcoming lectures and events that we have. I'm going to introduce Father Pogorelic, who will give the introductions to the speakers today.
We have two outstanding speakers with us today. The first is the Reverend J. Brian Hare, who is a priest of the Archdiocese of Boston and president of Catholic Charities there. He is also a professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and resides at St. John's Parish in Wellesley. He is the former president of Catholic Charities USA and has served as a professor of the practice in religion and society at Harvard Divinity School. And he was also the chair of the executive committee of the Divinity School. From 1973 to 1972, he directed the Office of International Affairs and the Department of Social and Political Affairs at the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops. During this period, he also served as the Joseph P. Kennedy Professor of Ethics at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Father Hare's teaching and writing focuses on issues of ethics, foreign policy, and international relations, as well as Catholic social ethics and the role of religion in world politics in American society. His publications include Catholicism and Democracy and The Just War Ethic Revisited. I first met Father Hare when I was working on my dissertation, and he kindly made time in his busy schedule at Harvard to allow me to interview him. I also know people who were served by him pastorally when he was in the area, and they speak of his sensitivity and wisdom. Father Hare is committed to the work of justice both intellectually and practically, and we welcome him to Catholic University today. Professor David J. O'Brien is Loyola Professor of Catholic Studies and Professor of History at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester. He has written widely in the history and contemporary life of the Catholic Church in the United States. He has served as president of the American Catholic Historical Association and received the Theodore M. Hesburgh Award for Distinguished Contribution to Catholic Higher Education from the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities. Among his books are Catholic Social Thought, The Documentary Heritage with Thomas Shannon, and Public Catholicism. I also met Professor O'Brien when I was doing my dissertation, and he allowed me to interview him. This is an encouragement to graduate students. Keep working on your dissertation, and you will meet interesting people along the way. And a few years later, Bill D'Antonio and I interviewed him again for our upcoming book on Voice of the Faithful. David is most zealous in promoting Catholic social teaching and in encouraging the laity to be active participants in the church. He is one of the most widely traveled scholars in this regard, speaking in venues from small-town parish halls to large conferences. And we are happy to welcome him to Catholic University this afternoon.
I have a little handout for you that we pass around. There's not enough for everybody. It's about 25, but you can look it over and pass it on to your neighbor. A few little clippings and cartoons about the economics pastoral, some of which you may get a kick out of. Brian and I decided to divide this up a little bit, and I'm going to do odd extra of the pastoral, and he's going to do odd intra. He's going to talk about the content and the ideas, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the story of the formation of the pastoral and offer some comments about the outcome, kind of its fate. I'll try today to tell the story of the 1986 pastoral letter, Economic Justice for All, Catholic Social Teaching and the U.S. Economy. I'll then offer some comments on its fate, comments I hope will assist your discussion later today and in the subsequent sessions. In November 1980, the United States bishops meeting in Washington adopted a pastoral message on the subject of Marxist communism. A few years earlier, some bishops had asked for this letter because they worried that some church leaders concerned about the threat of nuclear weapons or in sympathy with movements of rebellion among the poor in Latin America had forgotten or ignored the multiple evils of communism that made necessary nuclear deterrence and occasional political repression. The letter, drafted by Yale University philosopher Louis Dupre, avoided politics and offered a clear, nuanced, and convincing philosophic argument against communism. It was a dead letter on arrival as a pastoral statement. On military and political matters, it was mourning in America for anti-communism, but pitched at the level of theory rather than global politics, anti-communism had lost even its religious market. But for some, the letter's passage provided an opportunity. When the vote was completed, Auxiliary Bishop Peter Razaza of Hartford, then and now an altogether unlikely bishop, rose to quietly offer a motion. Having completed a letter on communism, he stated, might it not be appropriate to develop a comparable letter on capitalism? Razaza, no innocent in these matters, had already gotten some support among his brother bishops, among them the ubiquitous Frank Murphy of Baltimore. He had cleared his initiative with conference president John Roach, and he had alerted, at the coffee break a few minutes earlier, conference power Joseph Cardinal Bernardine, that he was going to do this. An ally, Bishop William Wiegand of Salt Lake City, backed the motion with brief remarks about his experience of neoliberal policies in Latin America. After a few other comments in support, the bishops approved the motion by voice vote, then broke for lunch. Years later, Razaza only half-jokingly said it was the prospect of lunch that had determined the outcome. Conference process involved appointment of a committee by Roach, the conference president, assignment of staff to the committee by Roach and the conference general secretary, and selection of consultants to sit with the committee. At the time, the conference was at the peak of its influence, with a vast agenda, one part of which was preparation of a pastoral letter on nuclear weapons, a process that was gaining increasing public attention amid the resurgence of the arms race and talk of winning the Cold War against the evil empire. The peace pastoral was to draw staff attention and resources, accounting in part for the rather long, leisurely pace of preparation of its partner, what became known as the economics pastoral. In the spring of 1981, Roach asked Archbishop Rembert Weakland of Milwaukee to chair a committee to write the requested pastoral letter on capitalism. Together, they developed a 5-person committee, adding Razaza, known for his commitment to the poor and long associated with the Campaign for Human Development, Bishop Wigand, who would represent international concerns, Bishop George Speltz of St. Cloud, a close friend of Roach and a voice for rural America, and originally they asked Bishop Joseph Daly, Bishop of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, but he was ill, and instead they asked Archbishop Thomas Donnellan, an Irish-American New Yorker who was then the Archbishop of Atlanta. Donnellan good-naturedly told colleagues in the press that he would be the token conservative on the committee. But from a working-class family, he turned out to be a strong supporter of unions and working people. Jesuit Provincial Michael Laval of Detroit, a trained economist, joined the committee to represent religious men, and Sister Anne Margaret Cahill, Dominican, represented religious women. Father Hare, director of the Office of Social Development and World Peace, asked his young aide from Roaches, Minnesota, Ron Cretenmar, to staff the committee. Weakland insisted that conference veteran and longtime labor priest George Higgins served with the committee as well, and Hare recruited Donald Warwick, a Harvard social scientist associated with its Center for International Affairs. Warwick initially did much of the writing. Later, economist Charles Wilbur of Notre Dame joined the team of consultants. In its early months, the Weakland Committee struggled to clarify the theological foundations of its work. In late 1983, the University of Notre Dame sponsored a symposium on the economic problems they were discussing. The bishops were especially impressed by the presentation of 2 Jesuits, biblical scholar John Donahue, universally known as Jake, and moral theologian David Hollenbach of Boston College. Both accepted invitations to join the committee, and they proved invaluable. Donahue, deeply engaged with the historic commitment of the Jesuits to the option for the poor and the integration of faith and justice, provided clear, convincing scriptural arguments for some of the pastoral central themes. Those sections won universal praise from the bishops. In addition, he was a consistently helpful committee member. Hollenbach, another John Courtney Murray disciple, shared Brian Hare's remarkable ability to articulate the church's moral teaching, to win the trust of the bishops, and to speak with genuine authority to a wider public. Like Donahue, he worked well with the committee process, and he was to become the major drafter of the pastoral letter. After discussing capitalism and socialism with Michael Harrington, the socialist leader, Nixon White House advisor Herb Stein, and Carter economic advisor George Shultz, the committee followed the advice given to them at the start by Monsignor Higgins to ask permission to change their mandate. Capitalism was too big and complex a subject, and the committee had no appetite for extended theoretical discussion comparable to the pastoral letter on communism. Instead, they opted to apply Catholic social teaching to the American economy with particular attention to 4 areas: unemployment, poverty, economic policy and planning, and the relationship between the American and the world economy, especially the third world. They expected to receive a lot of attention, given the many shifts in economic policy associated with the Reagan administration and widespread concern about materialist resurgence over the last decade. They see the cartoon about the 7 deadly sins isn't necessarily directly related to the pastoral letter, but I love that cartoon. I especially like Envy, who's watching Greed on television. You'll take notice of that. As Rosado recalls, the project focused on 2 objectives, which they later made clear: educating the public about Catholic social teaching and assisting the bishops to offer a coherent moral voice on specific economic policies. This decision to apply Catholic social teaching to outstanding economic issues was strengthened by the simultaneous experience of Bernardine's committee writing the Peace Pastoral, where their process of articulating church teaching and applying it to specific policy choices had won wide approval among Catholics and drawn remarkable public attention. It seemed to embody the vision of theologian John Courtney Murray, demonstrating the church's capacity to serve as a community of conscience and also to contribute to a public dialogue aimed at developing a public moral consensus. The Weekland Committee did not start from scratch, of course. In the 60s, the bishops had experienced the Second Vatican Council while wrestling with issues of racism, civil rights, and an unpopular war at home. At the same time, through their engagement with race, urban violence, and the pastoral needs of a growing Hispanic population, the bishops took on the problem of poverty, reaffirming their commitment to the work of Catholic Charities and launching the innovative Campaign for Human Development. Their on-the-ground experience with poverty was the basis for a long series of statements on welfare reform in 1970, the environment in 1971, correctional reform in 73, the world food crisis in 74, domestic food policy and gun control in 1975, the aged and new immigrants in 1976, Native Americans in 1977, the handicapped in 78, and the energy crisis in 1980. They gave consistent attention to issues that slipped from national attention, including health care, and in 1972 and again in 75, they backed strong federal efforts to extend low and middle-income housing. In 1976, as their work just a decade before the publication of this letter, they pulled their teaching together in a comprehensive statement, The Economy, Human Dimensions, in which they affirmed many of the principles that would guide their work in the 1980s. As the committee proceeded, Hare and Higgins brought word of the experience of the drafting process of the Peace Pastoral. The very existence of a committee considering nuclear deterrence had drawn public attention in the midst of the arms escalation and the nuclear freeze movement of the day. The first draft inadvertently became public and aroused enormous media interest. Across the country, newspapers, pundits, and grassroots groups were talking about the bishops, nuclear weapons, and deterrence. The committee, Bernadine's committee, skillfully turned that attention into an asset, making the pastoral letter a genuine contribution to authentic public dialogue. The only earlier example, perhaps, was Pope John XXIII's Pacem Terris, written in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Its 1963 publication was followed by a round of international and interfaith conferences, and then by near revolutionary reconsideration of church teaching on peace at the Second Vatican Council. The Bernardine Committee drew on that legacy of Catholic reflection on war and peace, made it better known, and applied it carefully and honestly to the country's most serious issue, and in both state and in the church, society and in the church, it made a huge difference. The Weekland Committee could not expect to have the same impact, but interest in the ethics of economics was intense, once again in part because the public context of the debate about economic policy was changing dramatically. Long taken for granted assumptions about abundance had given way to pessimism in the 1970s, and then to a resurgence of once discredited ideas about free markets, the failures of regulation, tax cuts, deregulation, inflation, deficits, and shortcomings of social policy were accompanied by disturbing trends in corporate ethics and popular culture, all stirring widespread concern about values and behavior as well as policy. Weekland's bishops found that many people were quite ready for a conversation and eagerly accepted invitations to talk with them about economic life. The committee therefore adopted some of the Bernardine Committee's strategies, which can be clustered under three headings: consultation, the management of controversy, and the drafting process. The Bishops' Conference had been experimenting with consultation for almost 20 years. They had discovered its public potential during the ill-fated call to action process, and the record will show that the Weekland Committee met with almost everybody. The committee listened to some 126 experts at 18 meetings and hearings. Those are listed by name and place at the end of both the first and second drafts of the pastoral. They met in cities and countryside and airport hotels. They met with Nobel laureates and officials in charge of world and national banks and treasuries. They met with public officials of all sorts and with representatives of economic interest groups, including corporate bosses and union leaders. With the help of the church's networks, with community organizations at home and abroad, they even met with a lot of poor people. Weekland and his bishops once again demonstrated the remarkable and too little appreciated capacity of Catholic bishops to convene people across the usual boundaries. And for all the bishops, it was a learning process. And Weekland, musicologist and Benedictine monk, led the way, reading everything he could lay his hands on, listening intently to all comers, even at one point successfully contesting a point with Nobel Prize winner Kenneth Arrow. Drawn to some highly publicized meetings with top corporate leaders, Weekland and other high-ranking bishops were respectful, but not in the least intimidated, confident of their position as pastoral leaders and champions of Catholic social teaching. They were, of course, critical of many aspects of American economic life. Led by Donahue and Hollenbach, they took their stand on the option for the poor and affirmed the right of all to fully participate in economic life, the opposite of marginalization. This informed their approach to the specific issues of employment, poverty, and trade, and found fullest expression in a section on cooperation. While they had deliberately decided against an evaluation of the capitalist system, they did want to bring their specific examples together in a comprehensive recommendation for cooperation as opposed to competition. This section, which came to be called eventually a New American Experiment, Partnership for the Public Good, called for private-public partnerships comparable to those well known to the bishops in local economic development work, have in mind community development corporations. Like their policy recommendations, this section, while still practical, marked the distance between Catholic social teaching and rigid free market approaches to economic and social problems. This critical approach and concern that the bishops would criticize capitalism as a whole drew the committee into controversy almost from the start. The most important opposition came from Michael Novak, who was invited to testify before the bishops on 3 separate occasions. Novak was a uniquely American public intellectual, well schooled in the Catholic tradition, and deeply committed to making Catholicism a constructive force in American culture. Like a number of other Catholic Americanists, Novak reacted against what he took to be an overly clerical move by Catholic social activists to apply scriptural quotes and papal mandates to American society without attention to American achievements and lay experience. Novak's location was now the economy, where he offered a critical response to liberation theology. Part of his argument was anti-communist, part resistance to biblical literalism, part critique of classic Catholic social teaching. There he thought bishops and theologians underestimated the importance of the free market and the institutions of what Novak had come to call democratic capitalism. Novak assembled a group of business leaders led by former Treasury Secretary William Simon and some sympathetic intellectuals, and they issued their own counter-pastoral in advance of the bishop's first draft, winning headlines and challenging the bishops just a few days before the 1984 presidential election. The substance of the so-called lay letters celebration of what they called creative capitalism involved 3 major points. First, Catholic social teaching in general and American social thought in particular gave too little credit to the marvelous mechanisms of the free market. Novak and his team wanted to affirm the productive achievements of the American economy. After all, as they saw it, wealth was a prerequisite for distributive justice, and capitalist economies produced wealth, socialist economies did not. In Reagan-era terms, if you wanted to help poor people anywhere, economic growth was a top priority. Novak's take on this was cultural as much as economic. The bishops could and did respond to economists and businessmen that they were moral experts, qualified to comment on the process and the outcome of economic activity. Novak challenged them, though, on their own ground, arguing that American success demonstrated that prosperity, which made economic justice possible, required values and practices supportive of free markets, individual responsibility, enterprise, and family and communal values. On each score, the theme of dissent played into important movements among American Catholics. The theme of the market played into increasing suspicion of the state. The theme of production into deep-seated gratitude for family stories of liberation. And the theme of lay voice into resistance to moral positions arrived at without sufficient pastoral consultation. Weakland and his colleagues handled such criticism skillfully. When Novak and his team released their letter on the eve of the '84 election, the bishops, worried that the press would greet their letter as opposition to President Reagan, bent conference rules and adopted extraordinary security measures to ensure the release of their first draft on Election Day itself. Weakland and the staff used the extra time to train for handling the press, which Weakland did masterfully. So they tell these stories of sitting for hours and they would throw questions at Weakland, and like they do for presidential debates, you know. There were 250 correspondents, and one staffer counted 50 television cameras at the press conference when it was released. So there was tremendous interest. When the letter appeared, most mainstream media were respectful, and editorials in the major papers, like the New York Times, Washington Post, emphasized poverty, lining the bishops up on the side of poor people beleaguered by the shifting political currents of the 1980s. It was a position that did them credit, and it stood them well. Some papers did, however, mock the pastoral. The Boston Globe, which liked its content, was upset that it was delayed as the bishops, quote, ducked a fight with President Reagan, close quote. My Worcester Telegram had little doubt that if that fight took place, who would win? Our editors in Worcester said, quote, the pastoral letter was, quote, fatally burdened with the Great Society conviction that more government intervention is the answer to poverty. It is shot through with the sentimental notion that some people are poor because others are rich, and that wealth should be redistributed somehow. The bishops seem blithely innocent of the knowledge that wealth must first be created, and then the free enterprise system wins hands down over any government-controlled plan, close quote. Well, whatever the Worcester Telegram thought, the bishops themselves, as a body, received the pastoral very well. The draft invited responses. Many bishops duplicated the question sheets and passed them around. Interested groups sponsored their own feedback sessions, and thousands of pages of paper poured into conference offices. Staffers read the reports, sorted them into categories, summarized many, and set some aside to be read by the committee. In time, they set a series of questions for consideration by all the bishops when they met in Collegeville in June of 1985. There, the assembled bishops made a few minor recommendations. They wanted the letter to be shorter. They asked the committee to clarify the meaning of the option for the poor, and to clarify the different moral weight to be assigned to principles and specific recommendations. And they wanted them to strengthen sections on family life, education. And there were two large revisions that they asked for and eventually took place. One was to strengthen the section on food and agriculture. The rural bishops were a block, and they really worked for that, so the food and agriculture section got lifted into a central role in the paper. These changes were incorporated in the second draft, which was more quickly processed. So there, some changes were made to introduce a long section really on the church as an economic actor, on the theory that if the church is going to speak about justice, it has to be just itself. There's a long section added about the church's own and treatment of its employees and that sort of thing. And there were some other minor changes that were made between the third and final draft, which came into the annual meeting and was voted on in 1986 with only 8 dissenting votes. One criticism of the peace pastoral, I should say that the agricultural section, Joanne and I had lunch over at the Paulist Seminary this noon with Steve Bossi, who's over there and is now Director of Formation for the Paulist. And when we met Steve years ago, he was a director of the National Catholic Rural Life Conference. And he came to work here in Washington, and he was the guy that actually drafted the agricultural section. The people down at the conference headquarters knew they had to have one, and nobody had much experience with cows and stuff like that. So they had Steve drafted. So you can get Steve over. He can tell you about that whole section. Debate took place around it. One criticism of the peace pastoral was that it included no provision for follow-up efforts at education and public dialogue, although the bishops' offices did fulfill their promise to monitor arms policy on the basis of the strict conditions they had set forth in the pastoral. The conference weighed in on disarmament questions, and after 10 years produced a little noticed but truly impressive 10-year reconsideration of peacemaking responsibilities in the nation and in the Catholic community. I always have to say that because I think the harvest of justice is sown in peace. The document that came in 1993, 10 years after the peace pastoral, is a wonderful statement, and it's just a shame that it's so little known and so little read. It was a constructive, peacemaking statement. How would you think about public policy? You turn peace into a verb of peacemaking. It's a terrific document that deserves more attention. Domestic social policy in the church at large has a much larger and better organized constituency than does international justice and peace. And the bishops decided in the economics pastoral to establish a short-lived ad hoc committee on implementation complete with staff. In its year of life, the committee produced excellent educational materials to be made available to dioceses, parishes, and schools. A small subcommittee produced a proposal for a permanent church-sponsored research center on public policy. If you look at paragraph 362, they lay out a whole agenda of issues in need of further research. And that agenda was to be the agenda for this church-sponsored Institute of Research on Public Policy. But that proposal fell victim to the changing politics and limited resources of the national church. Catholic Charities, Campaign for Human Development, Catholic Relief Services, and the Department of Social Development and World Peace of the United States Catholic Conference Bishops continued their great work for the two objectives set forth at the start by Bishop Razaza: education of the Catholic public in Catholic social teaching and presentation to the federal government of Catholic positions dealing with poverty and economic justice. For that work, the 1986 pastoral remains an important and valuable resource. Its central messages, with the exception of the New American Experiment, well confirmed by innumerable papal pronouncements and by the recent compendium of Catholic social teaching. Finally, let me offer just a few comments for future discussion. Historian John McGreevy once suggested that the two most important historic changes in our country over the last half century were the civil rights movement, which dominated the post-war era until the 70s, and the conservative revival that reshaped every area of American life in the last quarter of the 20th century. At the time the pastorals were written, the Reagan era, the bishops seemed to be resisting that conservative trend. The two pastoral letters seemed to mark the emergence of American Catholicism as a public church, learning, in the words of Cardinal Bernardine's mentor John Dearden, quote, a new way of doing the work of the church in America, close quote. But seen through the lens of Peter Steinfels, to take just one able commentator, those events now appear in retrospect to have marked the end, not the start of an era. The publicly responsible American church they signaled gave way instead to subcultural resurgence across the board. Support for the National Episcopal Conference is obviously weakened, pastoral statements are rare, the public policy agenda has narrowed, and Catholic social ministry is approaching a deep crisis. All that is material for another paper, but let me make 4 points directly relevant to discussion of the economics pastoral. First, church politics. Ignore it at your peril. The year of the pastoral, 1986, was the year described by Kenneth Briggs in his book, Holy Siege, the year that shook Catholic America. You will recall investigations of Archbishop Raymond Hunthausen and Bishop Walter Sullivan, the discipline of dignity, disputes sometime embittered about the role of women, and the ouster from this very place of Father Charles Curran. Rome had become suspicious of Episcopal Conference, even as ours hesitatingly discovered its own voice. Bishops themselves wondered where the Vatican was getting its news about America. Appointments to key sees went to bishops less sympathetic than their predecessors to appeals to episcopal collegiality and shared political responsibility. The skills of Bernardine, Weakland, and others helped mask these shifts, but in retrospect, divisions were sharpening, and there were unmistakable retreats from national collegiality and an ethic of shared responsibility in public life, even as the pastoral letters were completed. In recent years, a characteristic approach to public life fostered by Murray, rooted in liberating experience of immigrant Catholics, has lost support to more sectarian and evangelical currents in church life, with the consequences well described by Steinfels. Second, renewal and reform. The experience of the economics pastoral affirmed renewal and exposed the absence of reform. Renewal was evident in the honest ambivalence, the dualism about peace and the poor. But commitment to peacemaking and in some form a preferential option for the poor were now enshrined at the center of Catholic social teaching, side by side with certainties in sexual ethics. Somehow or other, renewal had brought care for the least among us into our piety and politics, evident in polling data even among those with reservations about the church itself. But reform had not worked out as well. Nationally and locally, the bishops experimented with consultation, but never found ways to help the community work together. Shared responsibility went up the road of consultation, but hesitated at the door of power. Peacemaking and justice-seeking in American society must be works of the whole church, but the whole church had and has no form, and many saw no need. We did not know it then, but reform, barely begun, was almost over. Third, the role of the laity. This was partly a governance question. In 1985, Weakland lamented the absence of a lay forum comparable to the Bishops' Conference. But there was a deeper question of the very meaning of the lay vocation, well captured in a complicated article published just before the issuing of the adoption of the letter in 86 by Monsignor Higgins in America. One of the most notable changes in the several drafts of the pastoral was the reduction of attention to lay vocation and its replacement by concern for the family. In the first draft, the bishops in Chicago fashion, Higgins' article is written out of that Chicago tradition, referred to the quest for human dignity in workplace and public arena as the laity's path to holiness. I just quote part of that. This is in the first draft. Holiness is achieved in the midst of the world. In this letter, we have repeatedly pointed out how the decisions of many economic actors and institutions profoundly affect the lives and well-being of millions of persons. The constant effort to shape those decisions and institutions in ways that enhance human dignity and reflect the grandeur and glory of God represents the most important path to holiness. Men and women in business, on farms and factories, in governments and scientific and technical institutions, and in every other field of labor can achieve true sanctity when they respond to the call of discipleship in the midst of their work. The church and its ministry has a responsibility to nurture and sustain this response, close quote. Compare that, if you get a chance, with sections 332 to 336 of the final text. The latter is much more pablum-ish. They have several warnings about saying no, and they worry about maintaining proper religious values rather than material values. In these paragraphs, the text reverts to warnings about the lay, that is secular, dimensions of lay Christian life. Stands in sharp contrast to Archbishop Weakland's own ringing call to recentering Christian life in his remarkable reflections on the encounter with business leaders. This work is the key to the social. Behind this, I think, is a fourth factor, a countercultural impulse. In the peace pastoral and analysis that seemed to call for political engagement for peacemaking, yielded instead a pastoral appeal to an ethic of exemption and pessimistic descriptions of America as almost lost to paganism and ready to persecute committed Christians. The Weaklands Committee's countercultural conclusions are softer, but equally in tension with the analysis of participation in shared political and economic responsibility that formed the text, especially the section on the New American Experiment. Bishops and staffers blamed inattention to that constructive section on the culture's disdain for planning and cooperation. Perhaps it also reflects, though, the Church's tendency to place greater weight on negative criticisms of society than on its obligations to work for constructive reform. After all, isn't Catholic identity that which establishes our difference from the prevailing culture and our distance from other Americans? Countercultural posturing, and I use that word deliberately, seems built into American religious landscape. John A. Ryan and John Courtney Murray, Cardinals Dearden and Bernardine, Archbishop Weakland, Father Hare and Father Hollenbach all sought another way of citizenship and shared responsibility for the fate of the nation and the earth. But their position drew on reservoirs of Americanism, and Americanism was waning or falling into less worthy hands. Still, when the chips are down, the public world will be transformed in the direction of justice only by those who love it. The American question behind both pastoral letters was not whether their prescriptions were right or wrong, but whether, in the end, America really matters. Of course, these critical comments are retrospective and a bit penitential, because, like many of you, I was there and share responsibility for the history I describe. I stand in awe, when I go back to these papers, at the dedication and brilliance of the bishops and their key advisors, and I have been honored to count some of them as friends. The Economics Pastoral set forth a broad framework that must be the framework of church mission in America, a church in sacramental solidarity with the human family, and especially with those who are poor or in any way afflicted. An ethic of shared responsibility for public life, not us and them, but all of us together. And an awakening understanding that the church is Church 724, not just when its members are different in distance from all those others around us. If today we see the Economics Pastoral as the end and not beginning of one era, let us pray that in the future others will see it, as they will see Vatican II, as important signals of grace in a zigzagging journey of liberated and liberating American Catholics from outsiders to insiders, and will see their church reshaped by freedom and diversity as an ever closer approximation of the kingdom of God. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It is always a pleasure to come back to Catholic University. I've been here many, many times for multiple different reasons and enjoy each one. And it's always a pleasure to share the platform with David O'Brien, a respected colleague from whom I have learned a great deal. We did talk about a sort of breakdown of external and internal, that David would stress the historical narrative to some degree and the external context in which the paper existed. And I would do what I might call an internal assessment. Internal in two senses. One, as he has said, I was part of the process. And then secondly, internal primarily in terms of the internal structure of the document and a look at it then and now. So I propose to do the following. First, I want to make some comments that to some degree will overlap with David. I call it notes on the origin of the document. Secondly, I will look at three broad dimensions of the text: its religious vision, its moral argument, and its policy proposals. And then thirdly, I will talk about the Economics Pastoral in terms of its legacy and continuation or future. Sort of notes on the origin of the document. When I thought about accepting this assignment of doing it from the inside, I thought of Dean Acheson's book, Present at the Creation. Not that you're about to get an Achesonian performance. But Acheson's book, of course, meant that he was present at the creation of the post-World War II American foreign policy. But some of you may also remember the quote at the beginning of the book. The title of the book, Present of the Creation, is taken from a quote from a 13th century Portuguese king who said that if he had been present at the creation, he would have had some useful suggestions for the creator. And so it is in that sense that you get to go back over what you've once done in life and think about what you might have usefully contributed. But there is a way in which it's probably good to note almost the same as David has pointed out, but maybe let me just add a couple of things. The 1980 meeting of the bishops was the beginning of what we look at today. At that meeting, Archbishop Roach gave a presidential address in which he wove together three topics: the question of abortion in the United States, the question of an increasingly dangerous nuclear arms race, and the question of the poor. And that ended him up on the front page of the New York Times the next morning with a kind of impact that made the presidential address a kind of national statement, at least for a day. And then, in the context of the bishops' conference at that time, any bishop could stand up at the end of the meeting and make a proposal for what the conference ought to do. And curiously enough, at that time, there was no structured testing of these proposals. They were just made and sort of accepted. And so, as David indicated, Peter Rosazza stood up after the vote on the document on communism and suggested a document on capitalism, and that was accepted. And then Tom Gumbleton stood up in the same meeting and said it would be a good idea for the bishops to collect the various statements on war and peace that the popes had made and make them better known to the American public. Now, not only was there no testing process, but there also was an automatic assignment process. And that assignment meant that the committee I staffed was going to get both of these. So it looked like a freight train coming down the aisle in terms of the committee, because the committee, as it functioned, was simply not capable of doing even one of these, never mind two of these. It was in the nature of the committee. So I did write a memo to Tom Kelly, who was then the bishop, saying that you couldn't use the ordinary methods of the conference to do these two works, even with, at that time, my limited sense of what they were going to mean. So I suggested that they did somehow set up these ad hoc committees, and then, as David indicated, the president of the conference, who had a right to appoint ad hoc committees, moved forward from there and appointed the two committees almost simultaneously. Again, as David indicated, there was a change in the timing. Innocently enough, we thought that we could do the two together at the same time. The staffing done from our office on both of them and two independent committees. But within 6 to 8 months, we were way over our head, and Archbishop Weakland was gracious enough to stand back and say, let's put the economic letter in first gear and let the pastoral letter on the nuclear question move ahead. So that we never really stopped the process of periodic hearings and thinking about the letter, but intensive attention to it did not start really until the pastoral letter on nuclear questions was passed in May of 1983. I would say the first thing to be said about all of this, about the origin of the letter, is that at times I think people thought we had planned a grand strategy. The fact of the matter was we had no idea, and I confidently here speak for the bishops as well as myself. We had no idea that these things were going to explode into the American public and draw the attention that they did. That was not a planned strategy. That was us catching up with a train that was moving rapidly ahead. And so there was a way in which this got to be It went from, if you think of Gumbleton's proposal, let's put together texts already in existence to make sure Catholics have easy access to them, and Peter's proposal, which did obviously have more sort of explosive content, if you will, from the beginning. But still, we had published lots and lots of letters and documents over the previous years at the conference without this kind of attention, save perhaps the 1919 letter drafted by John Ryan. So I would say that I don't know anyone who could make a convincing case that we had a grand plan, that these were going to become, as they did in a certain way, national documents with commentary from all the major papers, with the New York Times, Sunday News of the Week and Review doing a full page of interviews with national leaders on the nuclear letter, and then, as David has said, multiple meetings with all kinds of people that we never would have gotten in the door to normally. So it was a surprise, and I think that is simply part of it. It also then became not simply documents in a national debate. Obviously, the Holy See was deeply involved in all of this. These drafts had to be sent to Rome for review and commentary, which we received back. And then Episcopal conferences became deeply involved in commenting on our material. That was more so on the nuclear question because the Europeans were very worried about the posture we were taking on no first use of nuclear weapons. But clearly, particularly the Episcopal conferences in the Third World took an interest in the economic letter, as did, for example, the German Conference of Bishops also. So, enough on the origins. That is my memory of where these came from. Let me turn now to three broad dimensions of the text, namely what I'll call its religious vision, meaning by that its biblical content and ecclesiological premises. Secondly, the moral argument as it was made in the text. And then thirdly, the policy proposals. Now, as I approach these three things, my argument would be that standing behind both of these pastoral letters of the bishops were two animating texts. In other words, two reference points that either explicitly or implicitly were with this process from the beginning. The first was the final document of Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes. This document, which asserted that the Church's role was directed not only to the kingdom ultimately, but directed to be a living sign of the kingdom in history in the midst of what the Council called the hopes and joys of the human community. This text legitimated this kind of involvement by the bishops. In other words, the baseline behind both of these letters were that they were extensions of, applications of the theme that the Council had called the Church to fulfill. The method of Gaudium et Spes, I'll speak about this a little later, was the method of the documents. The view of the role of the Church in the world of the two documents was the view of Gaudium et Spes. In terms of the moral content of Gaudium et Spes and its influence on the two texts, there was a significant difference. The Gaudium et Spes chapter on war and peace of 1965 was authentically a new contribution to Catholic moral vision, and we drew on that pretty substantially. If you look at the economic part of Gaudium et Spes, basically it faithfully puts together what has previously been said, but it does not add a great deal to it, even though the drafter of that section was the famous German social ethicist Oswald von Nell-Brünning. So it really did not add a new dimension to what had already been there in the social teaching, whereas the chapter on war and peace really was not simply a linear extension, for example, of Pius XII. The third animating text, if I can put it in this way, was the social teaching of John Paul II, a very powerful influence on the economic letter, and on the nuclear letter, decisive interventions at certain points. Finally, behind the animating text, there were three individuals whose shadows were in the room whenever we were drafting or talking about what the church should do. As David has identified them pretty much, John Courtney Murray and his view of the role of the church in the United States, John A. Ryan with his lifelong the dedication to applying Catholic moral vision to the complexity of economic life, and George Higgins, who brought not so much original scholarship, but a vast experience in the work of the social ministry, along with a penetrating intellect, and having read every book before the New York Times even thought of reviewing it. So, I mean, that was the mix of people that were behind the letter. The religious vision of the economic pastoral. The religious vision, I think, had two principal characteristics. First, it was a biblically based assessment of economic life. And secondly, it was grounded in certain ecclesiological premises. First, the biblical character of the text. To some degree, the biblical character of the text was innovation, because the classic Catholic style of social teaching, the social teaching of which John A. Ryan was a faithful reflection, the classic Catholic style was principally a social philosophy, not a biblical narrative or even a theological reflection. Certainly the papal encyclicals from 1891 through Pacem in Terris in 1963 are basically natural law reflections on the socio and economic order. That is pretty much what was expected of a Catholic view of the social arena. Now, there were before the economic letter signs that there were new pressures, new innovations on how the church should express itself in its public approach to society. There was first Gaudium et Spes of Vatican II, a document that is thoroughly biblical, theological, and ecclesiological, as well as ethical, with almost no reference to natural law in it, a really surprising document. Surprising particular in the sense that if you looked at Pacem in Terris in 1963, I think this century-long tradition of social philosophy was brought to a new degree of systematic organization by John the 23rd in 1963. So you have the high point of this natural law style of analysis. 2 years later, the next social document of the church is a very different text, Gaudium et Spes, biblical, theological, and ecclesiological. So there was a foreshadowing there. Secondly, although this was still fairly early in the history of John Paul II's papacy, John Paul II himself reflected, in a sense, both dimensions of Catholic social teaching. A philosopher by training, he would often have 80% of his letter be a kind of dense philosophical reflection, but then there would always be a kind of appeal to theological themes and biblical themes. And therefore, you had, surrounding the letter, you had these two resources that prefigured, if you will, a sense of change in the way Catholic teaching was to be described. And David has rightfully mentioned David Hollenbeck as so significant in this letter. David Hollenbeck organized a group of us, 4 of us, in the 1970s in a kind of forum in theological studies about Murray's style, which was clearly of the philosophical natural law style, and there was a discussion among 4 of us about whether one ought to stay with that or try and combine it, and what the resources were of both. So, the text itself, which drew heavily on the expertise of Jake Donohue in producing a biblical view, that text already signaled that, what had been reflected in the council as a guideline for us. The opening chapters of the pastoral letter were the biblical treatment, And without taking you through it, essentially Jake Donohue organized his reflections wisely. He taught us not to stay with proof texting. In previous papal encyclicals, if you look at Quadragesimo Anno or Rerum Novarum, when there is reference to the scriptures, it would drive a scripture scholar up the wall. I mean, texts were just plucked out of the air and planted in the midst of an otherwise independent argument. But not with Donohue. Donohue stressed that one needed to look at what he called the deep vision of the scriptures. Not so much the text, but the underlying vision which then finds expression in the text. He organized his remarks around three themes: creation, covenant, and community. And then he took us through a kind of reflection on what those themes taught us about economic life together, from what the church now calls the universal destination of the goods of creation that you find reflected in the Genesis account of creation, on through the teaching of the prophets and the notion of how the covenant with God is to be translated into a human covenant. Obviously, these biblical reflections were primarily aimed at Catholics, Christians, believers. That was said from the outset. The opening paragraph of the letter says this is going to be a biblically based reflection on the economy. And that followed all the way through to the very last paragraph, which again returns to a heavily spiritual and biblical reflection on the economy. The difficulty with this, of course, was that what about someone who did not share the belief that this was the Word of God, who did not share Catholic or Christian faith? What were you to do about the appeal to the wider community? Did you simply leave them out, or did you find another way to approach them? And I will return to that shortly. But first, let me finish the section on the religious vision by saying a word about the ecclesiological premises of the letter. The letter was grounded, again, in this wonderful paragraph from Octogesima Adveniens of Paul VI, where Paul VI says, it is not the function of the papacy to outline in detail how people should approach the social question. He said it is for the Christian communities in each place to take the broad principles, rules, values of church teaching and make them live in their own setting. That is what the bishops thought they were doing. So it was seen as a complementarity between drawing on the universal teaching and then complementing it with a reflection of a, quotes, local church. Put that in quotes because the term local church is to be argued about what it refers. This local church brought with it a consciousness of the particular location in which it lived and the role in which the country for which it was pastorally responsible played in the world. That was a very powerful theme in the Challenge of Peace, where obviously there were only two places in the world that could summon the power up to threaten the end of creation. But it also was the case when you thought about the role of the United States in the global economy. And so there was this ecclesiological premise that there was a vocation here for the local church, depending on the wider universal church, but then grappling with the specifics of what that teaching should mean. That then led to a final point about the ecclesiology. That led to a debate following upon the letter about the teaching authority of documents like this. That is to say, did a national hierarchy, if I can put it in that term, and that's always a tricky term in Catholicism because Gallicanism bounces out already, but did a local hierarchy have teaching authority? There were critical comments from Cardinal Ratzinger arguing that teaching authority rested with the individual bishop or with the bishops gathered in council. Enough debate was generated, including a response to Cardinal Ratzinger by the now Cardinal Dulles, who defended the proposition, as I remember him anyway, that there was a teaching authority that could be attributed to a local hierarchy. But there was enough debate about this that when the special synod commemorating the 20th anniversary of the closing of Vatican II happened in Rome, Bishop Malone, on behalf of the U.S. bishops, said, we would like clarification on this theme from the Holy See, because we have thought we exercise teaching authority in doing these documents and other documents. We'd like to know what you think. I think among theologians it may not be a settled question as yet, but it certainly was opened by this question. You turn then from the biblical or the religious vision to the moral argument. Now, the role of moral argument in the pastoral letter, to some degree, was to return to the classical style, to be a reflection of Catholic social teaching as social philosophy. Now, I raised the question earlier that the depth you get from the biblical narrative may be countermanded by what you lose in using an explicitly religious, faith-based language when you're trying to speak to a wider society, if you are trying to speak to that society. Indeed, I would argue that the function of natural law in Catholic moral theology and social ethics has always been twofold. It has been driven by the question of how you extend a religiously based moral vision to address two things, complexity and pluralism. The biblical narratives, rich as they are hardly analytically acute at taking apart globalization or marginal tax rates. And pluralism is the question that if you seek to speak beyond your own community, in what language will you speak? So there was some recognition of the limits of the biblical vision, and if you translate it back here to the United States, the question that circulates around any letter like this is how should one speak as a religious community within the wider political community? And to some degree, if you look at sort of evangelical style, which is often direct translation of biblical statements into the political order, or at the other extreme, my former colleague John Rawls, who is deeply worried about any religious reference in a society like ours, Catholic teaching tries to go down a middle road. It seems to me that it is rooted in a religious vision but articulated in non-religious terms. So the moral case was a return to the classical style with its own innovation. The background texts were the social teaching, and then particularly the teaching on human rights of John the 23rd and John Paul II. David Hollenbach was particularly incisive and important in this section as he talked about human rights as the minimal conditions for life in community. So the moral case was an extension of the social teaching and a specification of it. If you tried to step back from the moral argument and say, how did we draw from the wider social teaching and make our case about the American economy, I think it revolved around, in retrospect anyway, I think it revolved around three ideas: subsidiarity, socialization, and solidarity. Subsidiarity in 1931 from Pius XI, socialization from John the 23rd in 1963, and then John Paul II's solidarity theme. These three themes, I think, not put together in that way, but again undergirding the text. Subsidiarity argues in Catholic thought for the value of a pluralist structure of society, of social organization. Socialization, on the other hand, recognizes the need at times for the state to be enhanced in its social role precisely because of the growing complexity of what we have come to call post-industrial society. Solidarity would find its strongest statement later from John Paul II, but it is the basic definition of social relationships upon which you then build the idea of a just society. Let me turn then to the policy proposals. And here, once again, there was a methodological debate about the pastoral letters. The methodological debate at the theological ethical level was, what is the authoritative weight of different kinds of church teaching? The approach adopted in the letter, I think, faithfully reflected John A. Ryan's idea that you have to not only cite general principles, but you have to specify those principles in concrete terms if you're going to give some sense of what the principles mean. Many of you will remember that in his discussion of the just wage, he worked it out to the penny in terms of what a just wage would be in the United States at the time he wrote his book. So there was a descent to the specific. That then led to an ecclesial-political debate about degrees of specificity in Catholic teaching. The bishops themselves, in both letters, distinguished openly between the difference between citing a general principle or statement in Catholic teaching with one level of authority, and secondly, then, entering the dense empirical complexity of relating that statement to concrete problems. They argued, I will paraphrase, that increasing specificity means declining moral authority, and used that as a premise. But the ecclesial debate, Michael Novak was part of this, argued it was simply inappropriate for bishops to be specific because they would divide the Catholic community on a contingent basis. The bishops looked at employment, poverty, and the U.S. role in the international economy. You will say to me, they also looked at agriculture. Here's another inside story. There was no plan to look at agriculture. We explicitly were not going to look at sectoral analysis in the American economy until the Midwestern bishops organized. And they organized effectively, and you have one sectoral slice of the American economy because of that. So those were the three problems that were looked at. Let me say a final word about, in a sense, the letter then and now. Because if you look back over the last 20 years, there were things that were not there that are here now that have and do impact our view of economic life in the United States. The three things I would cite are globalization, welfare reform, and health care. Now, the health care issue, again, we explicitly decided not to do a sectoral analysis, even though the bishops had spoken on health care previously. But if you look at all three of these issues, to some degree, they all touch on a theme of the teaching of John Paul II, his view of the market. John Paul II, I think, is the most positive pope in the Catholic tradition on the value of a market economy. But having cited the assets of a market economy, he then talks about the limits of a market economy. Namely, if you don't have any resources, no matter how well the market works, you're not part of it. Secondly, that the market is not able to distinguish the difference between goods. So you can draw a supply and demand curve for selling Lincolns and a supply and demand curve for health care, and they both look the same on the page, but you can survive without a Lincoln, but not without health care. So all three of these major questions, globalization had not yet peaked in terms of an analytical concept. We were still talking about interdependence, the steps short of the kind of integration that globalization implies. Welfare reform was a huge debate about whether you rely on the market or safety net or some combination of both. And then healthcare is obviously still with us as a major debate, and you couldn't write a pastoral letter today without addressing it. So those are things that were not there. I do not say that the principles that are there couldn't handle them, although I do think globalization poses the kind of qualitative empirical challenge to the Catholic normative tradition that industrialization posed at the end of the 19th century. That is to say, so intense, so broad, and so complex that you need the kind of move forward in development of doctrine that one found in Rerum Novarum in addressing industrialization. I have gone on too long. I had some remarks not unlike David's about kind of where we are and where we're going, but I think we have taken more than enough of your time, and I'm not too sure I'm right about where we're going. So I will cease and desist.
Anyone like to ask any questions?
Here, at the end of your talk, you identified three things: globalization, welfare reform, and health care. I'm wondering whether or not the bishops have a role today or in the future in addressing.
There was passing reference to it in the letter, a sentence here and there. Nothing in any depth at all. Since that time, John Paul II pressed the church to enter this arena, and the Bishops' Conference has actually been quite actively involved in interreligious approaches to it and has produced some material on it. But the letter, it was one of those questions that simply was barely touchable. I mean, the sentences were about, they were not explanatory.
Yes.
Given what's happening now at the U.S. Bishops' Conference, what do you see as the church's role in terms of its teaching authority and its moral conscience for the U.S. today?
You asking me or David or?
Of you, and then David.
Okay, all right. Well, I think there are multiple dimensions to this. First of all, when you read those two pastoral letters, it is hard to think of the bishops having the kind of confidence today they had in those letters in light of the last 5 years. I mean, moral authority is harder to come by today in light of that. I mean, we just have to acknowledge that fact. Secondly, I think that plus the questions of finance and vocation have turned the bishops directly internally as their primary concern. I think two former presidents of the conference, Bishop of Galveston, Houston, and the Bishop of Atlanta, both whose names on block. Fiorenza and Gregory. In combination, said that. They said that, and I think they probably were simply citing what they understood to be. And so that's a second problem with their mind. Thirdly, the finances combined with that, the internal aspect, I think, have yielded cuts. It's hard to have a national voice if you are not sufficiently staffed and if you don't have a sense that this is part of what you ought to be in a position.
I might just say that the most striking thing to me about the recent reorganization, which was not a secret, is the absence of any significant public voice arguing against the downsizing of the Episcopal Conference and arguing in favor of a strong National Episcopal Conference. In 1985, when the bishops met in informal session in Collegeville, Minnesota, in order to develop greater collegial spirit among themselves, I wrote 2 articles arguing in defense of a strong National Episcopal Conference to guide an American church. And I did so because at that time I felt that many of the people I was associated with did not see the value of the Bishops' Conference and were involved in a process of hunkering down in their own ministry or their own local situation. I think it was dramatically evident in the last year that no one cares enough about the conference to have supported its strength and its continued expression as an important theological phenomenon. Now, I'm not surprised because the silence in the church has been deafening over a variety of issues in the last 5 or 6 years. But it's extremely disappointing. That is to say, there are, even the most simple, non-politicized position about any one of a number of questions in the church in this year would say there's a terribly important role for the bishops acting together as a national church. And yet they are going to lack the capacity to do so, at least the capacity they had a decade or 2 decades ago. So that's a strong statement. I think it's striking that there's so little evident concern. It's tied in with my argument about Americanism.
Dean?
On the premise that the loss of moral authority is a sad thing, something we should try to regain. What suggestions do you have that the bishops could take or that we all could take to regain that?
Well, I think the first steps, I think, have been taken with these various reforms about how you deal with the issues that caused the crisis, namely sexual abuse. I mean, my impression is that outside observers find, on the whole, the reforms that were made within dioceses and other places not only defensible but significant. So I think that's the first thing, and you've got to stick to those. You can't afford, insofar as it's humanly possible, you can't afford any kind of major flare-up of something like this again. I mean, it's just basically you've got to have, you've got to treat this the way banking systems treat bank examiners. They've got to be on top of this every time. Now, the problem with that is that that turns the attention ever internal. So here's the dilemma they face. That's one thing. I think the second thing is, to be honest, the number of bishops who were at Vatican II are very, very few. And that was a catalytic conception of the hierarchy and episcopacy that carried people forward in their own way. I remember an article by Emmett Hughes on John Courtney Murray. Hughes accompanied him into St. Peter's Basilica during the first session, second session of the council. Murray wasn't there the first session. And Murray said, "These people will never be the same again, for they have learned they are not simply the branch managers of the organization where they are, but they have responsibility for the whole church." And therefore, there was a kind of catalytic influence. Obviously, you can't produce a council out of the air every time, but the continuity of that vision needs to be sustained, even though no vision can be sustained without change. I mean, I mentioned Gaudium et Spes. Gaudium et Spes is now a debated text rather than a consensual premise. And that debate started a bit at Vatican II, but it is much stronger today. So how you build that vision? In other words, if the bishops don't feel they ought to do this as a major imperative, then the structure of the conference is not relevant.
I would just make a simple proposal. I could spend an afternoon probably thinking of proposals Dean to offer, but one would be that in 2004 the bishops issued a statement of faithful citizenship that was a broad statement and summary of the Church's response to many public issues, written in the spirit, I think, that Brian outlined in terms of method. And I think it was our responsibility in 2004 to try to make that document better known and to do what we could to incorporate it into the pastoral and educational life of the Church. It's now our responsibility to take our bishop to lunch and let him know that we hope in 2008 the text will have a similar broad, deep, biblical vision expressed in common terms that are appropriate for the political discourse. They could let us know we want to continue to have that kind of vision before us, and that we want to work together to try to make that vision come to life in our local church and local communities. And let me tell you, that may sound like a simple proposition, but it's a political proposition. It will not be done unless there are organized efforts to ensure that that vision continues to be available to us as a resource for renewal in the years to come.
Bill?
In your opening remarks, you quoted from Archbishop Roach's 1980 presidential address, and you mentioned 3 topics, one of which was abortion, which has not ever been mentioned in relation to overall problem of the Church's social teachings. It happened that was 1980, and that's when the Christian right introduced the plan of the Republican Party opposing abortion, and Reagan adopted it. Would you reflect on the possible impact of the way in which the bishops have shared their concerns over social justice broadly and narrowly on abortion and its impact on the larger social well-being?
Well, of course, actually, the strong emphasis of the Bishops' Conference was prior to 1980. In 1976, they adopted the pastoral, I think it was 76, they adopted the pastoral plan, 74, I think, the pastoral plan, which was a very detailed plan about playing a major role, organizing down through church districts. So that was there. The 76 presidential election, the Carter-Ford election, the abortion issue ran through it. And given Roe v. Wade, Catholic bishops are not going to be silent on the abortion issue. Now, there have been attempts to tie together the right to life arguments with the social justice, war and peace arguments. And I think that is a doable thing within the Catholic framework, that I think the intellectual resources are there, that you can talk about both defending life and promoting life, and you can put the two together. Intellectually, I think it's entirely a coherent proposition. You then will get, and have gotten, concrete strategic arguments against that notion, because people say by doing that, well, I'll give you two sides, and then I don't want to talk too long. Let me just think of these two quotes because I remember. When Cardinal Bernardin tried to tie the two together, there was a very strong response from some parts of the pro-life movement saying he was eroding the pro-life position by connecting it with war. On the other hand, a major former government official in the United States, who had been not a Catholic, who had been very helpful to us in the writing of the pastoral letter as an advisor, when Bernardin made his speech in New York that tied these two things together, he said to me, that is a fundamental mistake. You people now, this was right after the peace treaty, he said, you people now hold a strategic place in the debate about nuclear weapons, and you will erode that place by tying it to abortion. So you would get arguments, although I think you can get intellectual coherence, you get rooted arguments about strategy.
I could just add a little bit. Father Brian said that you have this dualism that he outlined very clearly in these pastorals of a biblical vision expressed in Christian terms, and then a public language for the larger civil discussion. And in the peace pastoral, that's clearly stated in the introductory section. They say we're going to speak about two purposes here, two languages, two audiences. The dualism is very, very clear. And he talks about how we try to hold these two in tension, right? The one, the biblical, calls us to a kind of fidelity and a kind of witness to the gospel. The other calls us to the negotiations necessary to live as responsible citizens in the country. And Father Brian, all the people I mentioned, John A. Ryan, John Courtney Murray, that's what they've tried to give us. And it's a position appropriate to where most of us find ourselves in a post-subcultural church where we're full participants in the American reality. It's that position that has lost its pastoral foundation and its capacity to generate support within the church. And the reason, I think, is that the biblical, the more religious language is capable of producing a sense of identity and distinctiveness for us as Catholics, because it grounds our sense of our difference and distance from other Americans. Whereas the other position, the position of a negotiating public policy, seems to erode our distinctiveness and our difference, if not our integrity. So I use the word posturing deliberately, holding on to that biblical position without really taking responsibility for the negotiation of the complexity and the pluralism that we face, is appropriate for the church as it tries to restore a sense of itself as a distinctive institution. But I think it has to be challenged everywhere, because it actually brings about the very secularization it's designed to avoid. It confines meaning and moral force and power to our distinctively Catholic positions that set us apart from everybody else. And that's why I said kiddingly to my Hecker Paulist friends at lunch, hold your breath for the return of Americanism. It has to come back, because without it, we will never recover the sense that these people had of real responsibility for the American public reality. Do we really care about that? Is it really important? And that, I think, is what we have to really wrestle with. I think it's crucially important. I wish I had better ways to say it.
Well, what also happened on that, though, David, what also happened is that just as John Paul II combined the two in his teaching, he contributed to both sides of the argument. When he'd go to the UN and talk about human rights, it was Murray-esque, But the quotes you refer to in the Challenger piece that takes this in the direction of a countercultural quote, they're his quotes. They're his quotes. Be ready for martyrdom. Be ready. Martyrdom is not to be considered unusual. Later in Evangelium Vitae, obviously you always have to be ready for conscientious objection, but he stresses it as a much more likely reality, so that his impact on this was very significant. And the final point I'd make also is that then the sort of Murray-esque Higgins view became a debated reality internally. I mean, obviously, somebody like George Weigel feels that a number of us didn't accurately interpret Murray. So you had a debate about what Murray meant, as well as a debate about whether it ought to be biblical, philosophical, public policy versus evangelical witness. And I think your point is absolutely right to me about what we need, but we've got a very pluralist set of players here if you simply read the Catholic journals across the line.
For David and then Brian, going back to the conflict very mild between Virgil Michael and Johnny Ryan, our own time Catholic people, our friend down at Duke, Michael Baxter, maybe you could start, David. The tension between spirituality, personal transformation on the one hand, and reform on the other. I think it's got a lot of implications for our students, but also for the population, especially the youth population, with their emphasis on if their interests at all in spirituality rather than social change. Is that modified and intensified or what?
It's certainly refreshing and interesting and precisely at this point to go back and pick up that little book of Weakland's papers and essays on the economic pastoral, because he talked a lot about liturgy and spirituality, and the sections in the letter that were larger actually earlier and then cut down a bit at the end all refer exactly to that point. So he was wrestling with that, and I see him kind of struggling to figure out a way to make it appropriate within the text of the letter. But I do think you're right. There's a kind of deeper question here about the connections between liturgy and life. And of course, the big issue in our diocese this week is that lay people not only can't wipe the vessels, they can't have the key to the tabernacle anymore. The priest or deacon, of whom there are not many around, have to be found to open the tabernacle. So that's a big fight. Now that's a different kind of angle, isn't it? And the whole thrust is away really is more towards an older kind of establishment of the liturgy, and spirituality is somehow creating this distinction, I guess, between the sacred and this kind of secular life of lay people. So, I want to revisit the Chicago Declaration on the Laity and that debate, because I didn't like it when it came out, probably because I was working at the Episcopal Conference and thought it was a criticism. But as I rethink it, and as I read this just reread last night, this remarkable piece that Higgins wrote in America just before the publication of the letter, which is very complicated, and I have to reread it 2 or 3 times, but it's precisely on this question. It's filled with discussions of liturgy, and we're not just about kind of talking about the surface of things here. We're talking about what's foundational, but it's complex.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Pat, that there are these themes out there developing since the 70s. I mean, at least since the 70s, I began to see that there were 2 totally different countercultural approaches that were adopted. The Catholic left was against war, capitalism, and basically the American style. The Catholic right was against abortion, pornography, and sex education. And you've got 2... Now, and I say that not to categorize people, I say it descriptively. Those were the issues that animated people on both sides, and they became convinced, at least significant numbers of them, not significant, neither side was significant, they became convinced that there wasn't any way into the mainstream culture that you could save your soul, much less witness to your values, except by witnessing against it. Now, 3 hours of watching American TV might turn you into a counterculturalist itself, but the fact of the matter is, this kind of witness requires that we live with things we don't agree with and don't leave the arena.
John? I was intrigued by your observation, Dave, that rereading the Chicago Declaration was interesting to you. You want to go back and tell us why it wasn't interesting to you when it happened? And if it's interesting today, what are some of the ways in which finding those nuggets of interesting insights into the participation of persons in the work of justice and economic fairness and diminishing inequalities in the society. Can we use that document as a way of moving forward after you've announced, I guess, witnessed here that you've had a second take on it?
It was written a decade before the past, but really in the wake of the Call to Action Conference in Detroit of 1976. And I don't want to kind of trivialize the debate, but part of it was there was too much emphasis on lay ministry in the church, not enough attention to the life of the laity outside of the church. Well, at the time I said, well, in fact, we have to have lay ministers in the church because we are going to have less priests and religious, and we have to help people do that, and we have to take up all the issues that come with that. So I was very enthusiastic about programs that I taught and so on, where lay people were being trained in graduate programs in ministry and so on. So I wanted to defend those and to feel a strong sense of support for that group. So that's one reason I would have reacted. The other was that I think we felt in writing these two letters and being around the whole background of social ministry that led to it, that we were encouraging lay ministry and lay vocation. And I think we thought that this kind of approach was very supportive of the laity. And I resented Michael Novak's kind of lay letter as if the bishops weren't paying attention to the experience of lay people, which I thought they and their priests got through the pastoral life of the church. Looking back on it, I'm not sure that we were right, and that there wasn't something going on there that needed to be taken more seriously. And I think of it in terms of the image I have of the Chicago movements, and I used to go to the meetings and so on, but is the priest I admired telling a story in a sermon about a young man in the parish, young father, who had the family business falling apart, so he's spending a lot of time keeping that family business together, and he's deeply apologetic that he's not more active in the parish. And the priest is trying to tell him, that's where you're supposed to be, that's where God's with you. And that, Father Campbell used to say, the priests are the chaplains of the laity, who are really the church when they're out. Well, that's what the Chicago Declaration was getting at, is that the church is judged where it is on Thursday morning at 9 and 10 o'clock and 1 in the afternoon, not just where it is on Sunday morning. And somehow we haven't awakened that, and we haven't given our students, our wonderful, wonderful students at colleges like mine, a sense of lay vocation, that this vocation they take up, using their talents in the world, are precisely what God calls them to, and they're the center of American Catholic life and not the edge. I just think somehow we got to find a way to do that. So I look back on it and say the Chicago school was on to something, and we let it slip by.
We have some refreshments, so let's thank our speakers and then adjourn for some